Hello.
Hello.
Thanks to Melanie for inviting me here. It's always special for me to come see these meetings happening in the community and others supporting each other. It's always a privilege. But my name is Jason Akhtar and I manage what is called the Arts and Healthcare Program for University of Kentucky Healthcare. And we believe strongly in using the arts for healing and the power of the arts for healing. We sort of have a three-component system at UK Healthcare. We have the arts and healthcare, which I manage. So we do many different things using the visual arts, but also the performing arts, literary arts. We do workshops. We have live music in the hospital. We have a pretty amazing visual arts collection, rotating gallery exhibits throughout the UK Healthcare enterprise. We also have what are called the creative arts therapies. So that's where you have your licensed clinical professionals, such as music therapists, art therapists, and there are others. And they are trained to work at the bedside or in the outpatient venue and using the arts to achieve specific clinical goals. And then sort of that final piece to our holistic approach is integrative medicine and health, and that's where you find sort of your acupuncture, your massage therapy, your Ginseng Jitsu, aromatherapy. So I'm not here necessarily strictly in terms of autism, but I am here because I believe that the arts and the holistic alternative medicines are absolutely essential to everyone's health, regardless of your situation. So I could ramble on forever, but that's just a quick gist. I'm going to leave a stack of business cards behind if anybody wants to contact me. I had a printout for you, but I had a doctor's appointment, and the printout was back at my office, and I had to make a decision between getting here and stopping by the office. So I think next time, your next meeting, we can distribute. So specifically what I wanted to mention, I also co-founded an organization called Create in Lexington with a gentleman named Jesse Mark. And that is sort of the unofficial arts and healing arm into the community. It is not directly affiliated with UK. And throughout the year, we partner with all kinds of people, from clinical professionals to art historians to people that work in autism, people that work with Alzheimer's. We work with anybody and everybody, and that's how we like it. And so we have sort of a core group, and then we decide what a focus is going to be of our next set of events, and then we go out and we round up all kinds of great people to help us put that event on. So our next set of events is coming up in September, and it's going to be focused on artists with disabilities, but also any artist that wants to respond to that theme, and we're actually calling it ability and not disability. We want to be really positive and focus on everyone's ability to be creative in some aspect or another. And what that's going to mean is we're going to have an art call. And rather than you all trying to get all the dates straight today, we'll make sure that we get you the information you need, and I believe we're going to post it on the website and so forth. But there will be an art call going out, and it's anyone, all ages, all ability levels. And we really want to encourage, if you have you yourselves, any of your family members, children, this is not about being a professional artist. This is about putting something down in a creative fashion and sharing that with the community to raise awareness, to show how people have the arts in their lives. And what I'll do is we'll have an artist that's going to put that together in an exhibit, and that will actually end up being at the Pam Miller Downtown Arts Center. And this is going to be a really nice weekend when we have the reception during Gallery Hop on Friday night of September, and I'll give you all those specific dates. That's going to get a lot of attention because they have a really big exhibit going on downstairs. We're going to be in the upstairs gallery. And depending on how things work out, if we get enough submissions, I may also have an exhibit of the artwork at the hospital. And so we really want to get the word out there. And we're working with Latitude in Lexington. There's Studio Works in Louisville. And then we we're working with the Human Development Institute, the Disability Resource Center at UK. I know Melanie has contacts that she's going to channel this out to, so we're hoping to really bring this awareness of what other people are going through, how they can use the arts or anything else that's along the lines of creativity to improve life, help us cope, help us heal, help us be healthy human beings.
Yeah.
So that's what we're all about. And I don't want to take up too much time, but again, so hopefully at the next meeting we can disseminate the flyer that'll give you all the information, how to get the artwork to the community artist that's volunteering to arrange the exhibit, give you all the pertinent dates. And then one more thing, as part of that is the Human Development Institute at UK. We're bringing in Sky Kubikub from Chicago. She won the Win Newhouse Award. She's an artist that in large part works with clothing for the disabled and sort of does these sort of fun, have you heard of Sky?
Oh.
Yeah, she's really well known, and so she designs clothing for really not just for the disabled but for all. And the idea is that making the beautiful clothing that anyone of any capability or incapability is able to wear, be comfortable in, and also be expressive and creative while doing that. And so she's going to be doing a keynote speaker event at the Human Development Institute and a panel discussion. And then we're hoping to have some people representing the autism spectrum that would be on that panel as well. And finally, feel free to reach out to me if there's anything you think that I could help with or point you in the right direction that involves the arts, through either your interest in maybe wanting to volunteer with Create or find out about different approaches to using creativity, whether it's creative arts therapies, music therapy, art therapy. There are a lot of resources in town beyond UK in that field. So point being, I love to hear from anyone and everyone, and always happy to help if I can.
You have your cards you're going to
Yeah,
leave
it's all
with
a
us.
stack of cards. All right. That will be enough. So thank you for your time, and I hope that we'll see some family members, or again, if any of you are artists or any other family members that are, related to someone with autism or someone in that spectrum, we'd love to see, how have you has anyone used artwork to sort of cope and create being a family member? So.
And I'll say too, just being at UK Hospital is so amazing anymore with all the fantastic art that is all over, especially the Kentucky folk art. It's unreal. I love it.
And again, I could talk for ages, but one thing a lot of people do like to hear is that this isn't just pie in the sky and feel good. There's a lot of research out there, and it's growing rapidly that's showing the arts are absolutely essential, right along the level of diet and exercise. Some of these basic things, there's actually studies showing that you can have a greater impact by being involved in the arts and using your creative mind to counteract a number of physical and mental issues. So we're talking about science, not just, it's fun to paint a picture. It's what happens in your brain when you create that is the healing.
Yeah.
And Jason, Hazel just reminded me, I'm trying to remember how long ago it was.
Yeah.
We have a group called Eagles, which is for adults and people that maybe would fall in what we used to call Asperger's, that kind of category of autism. And they had a art exhibit with somebody playing beautiful music. I think he played the guitar or the cello, I can't remember. But then we had several different people having our actual art exhibits. It was clay, it was painting, you name it, and it was here at St. Michael's.
St. Michael's did it. Kay got it together.
Kay Wright.
And it wasn't just
person,
art
and so
peoples.
she has an adult son between her and Greg Weller, they put their heads together and they created this event. And it was just lovely. It was just a very well received. We had people of all ages that participated in the event. Everything from paint to carving to sculpture, you name it. It was very diverse in terms
And
of...
is that still an active group as well?
The Eagles
So
group is.
what I was suggesting, I will probably get in touch with you, if you could, they meet, it's a meetup group, they meet every other Sunday at the downtown Y, and they're always looking for activities
Absolutely.
and just guidance for activities.
Yeah, please let me know and I'll reach out, because like, we have time since we're talking September of this year, so I'd love to get them involved.
Yeah.
And as Mel, that's similar to how we usually have a musical component, so we'll usually have music at our gallery hop event. We've had dance before, so like last event we're really focused on Alzheimer's, and we had, Parkinson's, and we had the Parkinson's choir from town perform at,
I didn't know there was a...
First Presbyterian, yeah, Sentimental Journey, they're really good.
That's cool.
Yeah, so it's pretty special.
Mm-hmm.
Cool, excellent. Any other questions?
No, thank you for coming and telling us about all that.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's nice to meet all of you.
You're in touch with Melanie?
Yeah, so and I'm gonna get the flyer to her, and then you
Yeah.
guys can disseminate
Yeah.
that however is
Whatever dates you
appropriate.
ever have for anything like this that you think would, our group would benefit from, or that you need our help from, just let us know.
Absolutely.
We can certainly.
And I was gonna say, if you wanna share with me about your silent auction, I'd be happy to also see if I can.
Findley. Jordan is in her third year of doctoral training at the University of Kentucky in, at the University of Kentucky in the school psychology program. As a student, she has completed a school-based practicum in Central Kentucky under the supervision of a nationally certified school psychologist. She has clinical experience presenting assessment results to parents and research experience analyzing the content of individualized education programs for students with autism. So thank you so much, Jordan, for being here. Thanks for your patience. We had some announcements to get out of the way, but now we all know who you are. You know who we are. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you once again for having me. I really enjoy coming and talking to parents because I end up learning a lot from you guys, probably more than I ever learn in classes or at practicum, so it's always a good experience for me too. And as I'm talking, feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, anything like that. I'm pretty informal when I speak, and I don't want you to feel like I'm just talking at you for a period of time, so if something's not making sense, just let me know. So what I have for goals for the talk today, I'm first going to go over just real quick brief history and background of IEPs and this whole process. So we're starting this assessment process to get services, so background a little bit about on that. I'll talk about the different components of a full psychoeducational assessment, what goes into that. I'll talk about the language that's used when presenting results to parents. I'll then go in and talk about components of the IEP when it's developed, and then implications from the results to the IEP development. So based on what the results mean, what does this mean really for my IEP? And then I'm going to briefly talk about progress monitoring and how you can kind of check on your child's IEP progress throughout the school year. Okay, so brief history and background. First, the goal of assessment is not just to point out everything that's going wrong, it's also to identify what's going well too, because this is used to guide the skills that we're building up on. So just making sure that that's highlighted somewhere in the report is always really important. The IEP itself has historical roots in parent advocacy. So the whole Individualized Education Program was started because parents were really pushing for their children to be integrated in general education. So what that means is these plans are meant to be developed with you, not for you. So if you're going in the IEP meeting and the IEP is kind of just being presented to you, you have a right to say, well, here are my concerns, here's what I'm seeing, and I'm wondering how we can cover that in our IEP as well. It's not just the school's going to do the report and the IEP and then you just get to passively take everything. It's supposed to be a back and forth process. And just real quick, briefly, the students with autism actually have the highest levels of IEP litigation. So the biggest lawsuits related to IEPs tend to be for students with autism. And this is both for how they're developed and as well as how they're implemented. And I'm not telling you this.
Why do you think so?
My best guess is first that autism tends to be kind of complex, right? There are a lot of different various needs, so I think making sure that, so what that means for special education teachers, right, is that the plans really vary student to student. So I think sometimes they're like tricky, right? So because there's not like a set layout, it's not like, a learning disability where if reading's the problem, okay, we work on reading, so we're looking at social and communication skills, and we're looking at behavior, and also academics, so we're looking at a wide variety of areas. But other than that, I'm not sure. And it could be that there's a lot more strength for advocacy maybe, so parents with autism might push a little bit more when they're noticing things that aren't quite right, but I really am not, that's a great question, but that is what our research kind of shows, that the biggest levels of litigation and lawsuits tend to be for students with autism related to their IEPs. Once again, not telling you that so you can go in like guns blazing to the school, this is what I want fixed. It's to tell you that to make sure if you feel like a gut reaction, like this doesn't like feel right to me, it might be the case, and to kind of ask questions going off that feeling. And the last little thing I'll mention is that your admissions and release committees, or your ARC, or your ARC, depending on your schools, meet at a minimum once a year. That's not like you have one meeting a year and that's all you get. If you're feeling like something isn't quite right, ask for a meeting. That's your right. So that you can touch base, maybe adjust plans if something isn't being implemented or going as you are thinking it's going, and this kind of helps everyone get back on the same pace. Okay, so for our initial psychoeducational assessment, so these are your full-blown reports, as well as the subsequent reports. So every 3 years there needs to be a reevaluation where we kind of go through similar processes again to ensure the child is still eligible for special education services. What that tends to look like is first they'll talk about the reason for referral. So why are we all here today? What are the concerns we're seeing in the classroom, or what are parent concerns? And it'll go back over that briefly. The next thing you'll see are the assessment techniques. So they'll present you a big old table. It's going to tell you what kind of assessment was used, who administered it, and when they administered it, kind of all in a nice organized checkbox. It'll go over background information. This is both like your demographic information as well as social developmental history. It'll talk about educational history as well, so anything that's kind of happened before the assessment. What do we know going in? The next things the school will do are look at behavioral observations. So this will be what we're looking at in the school. So classroom-based observations, looking at your child in different more unstructured settings, like in recess, or for older kids, maybe like a gym time or lunchtime, stuff like that. The school will assess for cognitive functioning. So how's everything? How are mental processes going? What are maybe some strengths and weaknesses within your cognitive profile? They'll look at academic ability, so this is your reading, writing, and math skills. They'll look at social emotional functioning, so these are behavior problems, either internalizing, like anxiety, depression, as well as any externalizing behaviors. So these would be maybe like defiance. They'll look at communication functioning. Once again, autism is a social communication disorder, so we're going to look and see how your communication is working. This could be both expressive language as well as receptive, so what can you produce and what are you understanding, as well as pragmatic language. How well do you understand language when it's applied in the social context? Other areas that may be assessed include executive functioning, so attention, your ability to initiate tasks, your ability to kind of hold things in working memory. Adaptive functioning, so these are daily living skills. And then the last part of the report, and probably the most critical, is going to be the summary and recommendations. So if you don't read anything else in the report, that was probably where you're going to get a good chunk of information. And sometimes recommendations are not looked at as hard, at least in my experience and what I've been told. So really considering what those recommendations are for, and asking questions based on what is in the recommendations at the end. So I'm briefly going to go over best practices in autism assessment. Some ASD-specific measures for educational and medical diagnoses will be based on a standardized parent interview and structured observation of social communication skills. And what this tends to be, or our gold standard for diagnosing autism, is a combination of the autism diagnostic interview and then the autism diagnostic observation schedule. So both those things, we're looking at interviews with parents as well as kind of observing the student in a more structured context. However, schools may not always employ these best practices However, if they don't use those two things specifically, what absolutely should be included is a parent interview that covers early history and current behavior. So we're wanting to see a timeline of development over time, different areas of, so either early delays that we are seeing with language or social skills, as well as what are we doing currently? Because we know autism doesn't just maybe come out of nowhere, we want to see kind of a pattern over time. The school may also do more autism-specific rating scales, and what these might look like include the childhood autism rating scale. This includes observations as well as parent ratings. The social communication questionnaire is looking specifically at social and communication skills. And then the social responsiveness scale, which is getting at your more socially based behaviors. And once again, this is what would be expected for all, for an autism-specific assessment. So not autism-specific, but also include measures of intellectual functioning, language impairment, once again in those different areas. The language impairment assessment might also be done by a speech-language pathologist. It might be done by looking through even adaptive ratings of communication. It might be done more informally through school-based observations. This might look different depending on the school, as well as the child's skills. And then adaptive functioning, this is typically done either once again through a parent interview or through rating scales. And then additional behavioral or emotional disorders. So we're looking at things that are highly comorbid, such as executive functioning like ADHD. Especially students' age, we look more at those internalizing behaviors as well. So like depression and anxiety, we know those increase as students with autism grow older, so checking for those other comorbid conditions as well. This is not showing up how I kind of wanted to, but I wanted to show you this because during your IEP meeting, when we're presenting results, this is what they're kind of checking off to show that you have an autism diagnosis. And I'm going to talk about this, bring this back at the end of the presentation, because this should kind of guide what ends up happening in the IEP, right? So we're looking for a developmental disability evident before age 3, affecting verbal and nonverbal communication skills. And we're looking at a developmental disability affecting social interaction that is not the result of emotional behavioral disability and has an adverse effect on educational performance. So these are the 4 main components that we're looking for on this eligibility form. So what's nice and confusing for parents and caregivers trying to navigate tons of services and different rules is that a medical diagnosis does not guarantee educational diagnosis and eligibility. So unfortunately, how it works is that they're assessing for not only that the presence of the disability is there, but that there's some type of educational impact. And educational impact doesn't necessarily mean it's your basic reading, writing, and math skills. It can be in other areas, but there has to be a demonstration that it's influencing the student's ability to succeed in general education without support. So it's entirely possible that the school may do this evaluation and agree, yes, there is a disability, but find no educational impact, and then no services will be initiated. And then we can talk about if there's agreement or disagreement with that, with some steps you can take at the end as well. And then the result would be not eligible for special education services. And last, in looking at eligibility, we're really trying to align data from multiple sources. So we're not just going to give a cognitive assessment and make a decision if you're eligible or not. We're looking at how classroom observations align with rating scales and parent reports and other cognitive functioning and academic skills. We're trying to see patterns before we make an educational diagnosis or eligibility. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is get into terms to know, but before I do that, I'm going to pass around. This is a normal curve, and this will kind of help us, I think. This is what I think is the most confusing. And I'm going to do my best to talk through this, but as I'm talking, please let me know if you have questions or stop me in the middle, because I know it's confusing. And so how I'm going to set this next section up is I'm going to define all these individual terms on here, and then I'm going to present the whole curve, and we'll talk through that again. So hopefully by presenting it in a couple different ways, that helps a little bit as well. Because once again, I know this isn't intuitive information. But first of all, what are the different types of tests? So you can have, so for standardized assessment, all this means when we say that is that it's administered in the same way, with the same questions, and the same scoring procedures for everyone who takes it. So it's very consistent in how it's given. We can also have norm reference tests, and what this means is that the scores that are generated give the students relative standing in a group. So we're comparing how your child is functioning to how everyone his or her age is functioning. So the question that norm reference test answers is, how does a student compare to others his or her age? And an example of a type of assessment that's norm referenced would be cognitive functioning. However, you can also have criterion reference tests. And what this means is that scores are generated based on a predetermined benchmark. So a question that this might answer is, how does a student compare to grade level standards? And these standards may be determined by experts in the field. It could be that more informally, so like your third grade teachers are deciding what the student should know at the end of third grade. But the big part here is that we're comparing to a standard, not to how others are doing. K-prep testing is a good example of criterion referenced assessment. So now test language. So we're getting into the big scary stuff now. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a standard score. So this is a statistical average based on the performance of students testing in the norming process. So what the standard score does is it just takes everybody in a group, finds the average, and gives us a reference point. That's the whole point of really standard scores, is that in order to understand how your child is functioning, we have to understand it in comparison to a group. So as part of how the test was developed and normed, we are able to spread the scores out on that curve. Ask questions if you have them. I know that's probably confusing. It helps when we start to put it together, but and give concrete examples, and we'll start to work through that.
So if you did testing and you might fall several different places on the curve with your child, might hit different, depending on the area that was what they were looking at. I'm probably not saying that very well, but excuse me. Like say they did a IQ test.
Mhm.
Maybe they looked at processing speed.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
maybe they fell here for
Mhm.
IQ, but then when we looked at short term, or what is it?
Working memory
Working
typically.
memory, thank you. They scored here.
Right.
So you could kind of have little dots all along the curve
Right.
based on the kind of things that you were looking at.
I
Absolutely.
just went through this with Nevaeh, her IQ's 43, and I'm going,
And there are a lot.
she does, and, comes up
Right.
with so many wonderful ideas to do this and that, and then I look at this, and it's not what I see, I don't know if it's because I'm a mom, and, I just,
And I think IQ can be a really tricky one as well, because with autism, since the language piece is so strong, right? So a lot of cognitive measures tend to have at least a little bit of language. So if language is a big area of, not weakness, but maybe not as strong as maybe some other visual
her-
spatial
her
skills.
speech is very weak, because she
Mhm.
didn't have it for almost 6 years. So
Yeah.
of course, she's behind, but we do talk.
Yeah.
Maybe like a 6-year-old, that's one of her big weaknesses.
Right. So it's not uncommon, especially for students with autism, to see a pretty wide spread within the index scores. So we can have an overall composite. So if we put all these different components in a pot, we get one score that's like your overall IQ, right? But we know IQ is made up of lots of different things. So you might have something like, visual spatial that's way up high, and then something like language that's like 20 points lower. And then I will say, if you're seeing spreads like that in scores, it becomes inappropriate to look at just IQ overall, because that's not telling you anything, because the spread between your indexes is so large. So I will caution that when using broad, one just general composite. If you see a lot of spread between subtests or indexes, then the overall composite, the general IQ is not as interpretable. We don't really know what that means because there's so much variation. That's a good point.
Another way to look at it too is that the normal curve is not necessarily the one that will give you the best information for this particular course with autism. So scatter plots almost work a lot better because the height of the points can differ depending on what you're measuring, what in speech. So even though the one category is speech, if you're looking at expressive language or intonations, or they may all be different.
Absolutely, and that can be real extra confusing, right?
Yeah.
Because you're trying to tell me one thing is here, but all these other things are spread all over the place. I think the only thing really the normal curve does a good job with is helping us understand how we're performing compared to others within certain, within a range of what the test is able to do. So that's also another really important and overlooked caveat is that we're restrained by what the test is saying or what the test measures. And that also might not be completely appropriate when designing instruction. So, okay, you're telling me this, but what does this really mean for when we develop an IEP? But it does give us pretty good information regarding functioning compared to others. But making sure, once again, when we're interpreting those results, we're being careful in watching kind of how those scores might differ, both among the indexes and also in these different domains like we're talking about. But yeah, those are really good points. So we have one score, your standard score, and we also have a standard deviation. Really and truly, the standard deviation is just telling us how much spread there is of the scores of a test. So it's giving us an idea about how spread the data is with a normal curve and with things like IQ. So I'll go ahead and go with a concrete example real quick. The normal curve puts the standard score average at 100, and the standard deviation, or how much we expect the spread of the scores to be, are at 15. So if you are within plus or minus 15 points of 100, you are within one standard deviation, and that tends to be what we call the average range. And the normal curve is designed, right, so that we're kind of pushing most people within that one standard deviation. About 68% of people will fall within that range. But since we're spreading so much people into that area, you're also seeing a wide range. So that covers the 16th to the 84th percentile is within average. Once again, that's really overwhelming. We'll keep talking through that too.
And this is in third grade. This is all done when she reaches third grade. This is when this testing really starts to take effect. Is this third grade testing?
So this is any type of testing for a psychoeducational report. So it could be third grade, but it's
okay.
Yeah, with any type of initial assessment, and then every 3 years, typically, yes, these types of assessments will be done
Okay.
that are standardized. Okay, so like we were just talking about, this is a good visualization of how we have one overall ability that we're measuring. So if we're saying cognitive functioning, okay, so we get one standard score for that. But we can also get our indexes. So we know, once again, like we've been talking about, IQ is not just one big thing. It's made up of different other more narrow abilities. So things like your verbal comprehension, or things like fluid reasoning. And fluid reasoning is basically problem solving. So those two things are indexes. And those will also use that standard score basis. But then we get down to these boxes. And these boxes are what we're going to call our scaled scores. And these are our individual subtests. So if we pull back a magnifying glass and we're looking, what did you actually do with my kid while you were testing them? The boxes are the actual tests we administered. So for example, in this example, I'm talking about a cognitive test, and in the boxes, the similarity subtest, we're asking them, how are two things alike? And that's how we got your language score there. But we also combined it with your vocabulary score. So what is a apple? And that was your narrow ability or verbal comprehension, just in this example. But this works with anything that has one broad ability and breaks off into little domains. So you could do the same thing with academic achievement. You could put academic achievement in the top, reading in one of the other small boxes, and then you could say, well, reading was letter word identification, and then it was letter naming or something. So looking at individual what are you actually doing in the assessment? Okay, so, and these are become once again really helpful when we're seeing a large spread. So if I'm seeing within verbal comprehension that your scores are way different between the two subtests, that's telling me your verbal comprehension index may not be interpretable, which will then influence your overall IQ, once again. So, and our boxes are what going to be, we're going to also standardize those so we can compare them to others. So those are going to be called scaled scores.
I got another question real
Yes,
quick.
yes.
In third grade, for example, he gets ready to get tested.
Mm-hmm.
Now, normally he's, they're shy, kind of uncertain. Now, if a parent stays with them, or as a grandparent stays with them, they feel more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like they would do better on the testing with somebody there with them that they know are safe with
Mm-hmm.
than a stranger.
Yeah.
They would be shy and they're trying to get, these strangers trying to get them to do what they need to do. Where with us, he would do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would give him a decent score by us, somebody familiar with him being there.
Mm-hmm.
Is that done?
It depends. So sometimes yes, sometimes no. The problem, the good thing is that we'll get probably a more accurate representation of what they can do under really good circumstances when someone is with them, right? The problem with that though is then we're losing standardization. So it becomes harder to compare him to his peers, right? Because not everyone had their parent in the room with them while they were testing. So once again, good because we can see at his best this is what we would expect, but bad because then we're not it's not directly comparable to other in the who were his norm group or his same age
Is there a way
peers.
if you test them on our own and it's not quite good enough, and then all of a sudden, let's have one of the parents come in or somebody come in, let's retest him on this and watch him. That would show his true meaning, because if he's fearful, he's not going to be as open as he is with us. So have him test one way and then bring a parent in or grandparents and let him be tested and done with the same thing. And then see how he reacts.
Right. And I think for some things that may be appropriate. So if you're trying to test his basic math skills and the teacher's just giving him a worksheet, that might be okay. With things like cognitive functioning though, then you run into things like, well, those things are only supposed to be given about once a year. So if I give it to you once and then 2 weeks later I'm going to give it to you again, well then it's hard to tell if you're doing better because an adult's in the room or because you've just taken it a week ago.
You
So-
can change it a little bit though? Is there a way that you could,
It's
no?
standardized testing.
Oh, never mind, okay. Oh, well, I'm just trying to,
Well, it also depends on, you're right, it also depends on the purpose of the assessment, what are you doing it for? If you really want to find out some specific information that you're only going to use with that child, then you just want to know it whenever you get it. Whereas if you're going to compare it with the other kids in the class or other kids who are functioning that way, like for norm reference test, then you only want to do it at that one point in time when everybody else is getting that test.
okay.
What about accommodations though? Accommodations could you make available in standardized tests?
Yes, so like for things,
There might be other things, but other than having a parent there that
right. And once again too, we always going back to the purpose, right? So if we're looking at services and we know in the classroom that might not be available, we definitely don't want to bias the result in that way because we want to know what they need. And if a parent can't be there all the time with them or something like that, then we need to know what they can do without a parent there. Or else they might say, oh, well, look, he's fine, so he doesn't need it, he can do it. And then they're kind of like out in open water. But once again, going back to if the purpose is just to find out what he knows, then those things can be kind of put in place. And sometimes I don't think this is super common, but it does happen where sometimes psychologists will push the limits, so they'll make all these accommodations and see, well, if I push, what's the best score I can get? This would not be done for an eligibility testing, but if you're just curious, once again, to know what they can do, that can be done.
Okay.
But also would be needed to be noted in a report write-up, because if you take that to the school or something, they'd want to know what was done.
Right,
all this-
just curious,
yeah.
just seeing what his potential is,
Right.
without being scared or nervous or just be himself. With us, he's doing great just with us. When like a stranger, somebody, he's real shy and timid and it takes a long time for him to warm up. Not a long time, it's getting better, but it takes a while for him to warm up to feel comfortable to be out with somebody he doesn't know.
Sure. Sure, and I think a lot, especially in a testing context, that's a very new situation. That's pretty anxiety-provoking across the board. That can be, a really hard time for students doing new things, a lot of fear about doing a good job, or, so definitely understand those concerns. But yeah. Anything else? So once again, just to drive this point home, your index and standard score, so your overall IQ score, and then your index score, so your verbal score, your processing speed score, have an average of 100, a standard deviation of 15, and what is average is considered 85 to 115. So going even narrower, so what they're tested on, the individual subtest creates scaled scores, and it corresponds to an average of 10, standard deviation of 3, and average is 8 to 12. And once again, these are just so we can kind of see spreads of scores. And standardizing them, all it's doing, and all we really mean by that, is it allows us to make group comparisons. That's the point. We can see how your child is doing compared to everyone else in their same age group. So what this might look like if you're given a report and they're presenting all these numbers to you is they might say, all right, your subtests or composite are on one side and your standard score is on the other. So they might say your full scale IQ or your general intellectual functioning, whatever it is they label it, or your adaptive functioning or your academic achievement is a 68. Your specific skills, your index skills, are 70s or 60s. Okay, so that's how they'll kind of break it down. Overall individual indices. And then if we want to know even further down, what we'll do is we'll say, all right, so your overall index, your verbal comprehension score, what are the 2 subtests that go in there? What are those scaled scores? Once again, that's just getting smaller and smaller into what was tested and the standardized scores within each. And this is mine. Scaled scores are not typically presented in reports, depending on the school psych preference and how the results turned out. So if everything is pretty evenly spread, this probably wouldn't be in a report. If we're seeing a lot of widespread or variation between the scores, this would probably be presented. Some additional examples, once again, so your cognitive scores, your academic scores, adaptive behavior, they tend to have a standard score around 100, standard deviation of 15, average range is 85 to 115. Now to even make it even more complicated, a lot of the social emotional measures, so things that are going to measure depression, anxiety, as well as like maybe aggression or on-task behavior or attention, tend to be measured using T-scores. Once again, still standardized, same kind of pattern holds, and they'll have an average of 50, a standard deviation of 10, and average range is 40 to 60. And once again, these are standardized, so that just means it allows us to see how we're doing compared to how everyone else in my age group is doing. Why T-scores over something else, or like the standard scores for cognitive functioning, I don't really know. But that's just kind of how they've standardized their measures to make comparisons. Okay, so we know as practitioners that standard scores, standard deviations, all that stuff is really confusing and not easily interpretable. So we also provide things known as confidence intervals, and all this is telling us is the range we would expect it if we were to test your child again, right? So we know the measures we're using aren't perfect, they have errors, right? So when you're getting your score back and it's like, what the heck is this? This isn't what I see in my child. Sometimes there's error in our measures that we're using. Or it could be your child was having a really great day on Monday and then we finished the testing on Wednesday and was having a terrible day, right? So we know that that might not necessarily be their best performance ever. So we create things called confidence intervals to say, well, if we were to test this again, this is where we would expect the range to fall. So what it's going to look like is something like there's a 90% probability that, boys' true fluid reasoning index or true cognitive functioning or true adaptive functioning is falling in the range of 80 to 92. Once again, this is just telling us if we were to do this again, where do we expect his score to fall? And it gives us a probability rating. So 90% is typically used, it might be something like 95%, but the higher that percentage goes, the wider the range goes. So if it was a 95% probability, the range might be 75 to 98. So we put the range a little bit wider if we want to be more sure of where we think they might fall. Does that make sense? And then the last kind of way we explain scores is through things called percentiles. And it's just the proportion of scores that were lower than your child's scores. So it's not a percentage right or wrong, it's not like 75% of the questions they answered were wrong, but if your child is at the 75th percentile, it means he scored higher than 75 of the 100 kids tested. Once again, helps us give a concrete representation of where our child's falling on that curve. One more nice little visual. So average is right in the middle, that's with 1 standard deviation. Within 2, we're going to see both below and then above average, and we're going to spread our range from 70 to 130. And then about 99% of people are going to fall on the very outskirts from below 70 to above 130, or from 55 to 145. So once again, and I will say the closer that your score is falling to the middle of the distribution of scores, the more what we would consider like average or typical the scores might be. And scores that are falling below typical scores, like more than 1.5 and 2 standard deviations, with things that we might consider atypical, whether it's above or below. So once again, that 85 to 115, that average range covers 68% of people. From 70 to 130, we'll see about 95% of people fall within this range. And then from 55 to 145, about 99% of people are going to score within this range. So I'm going to start to transition a little bit to go into components of the IEP, now that we've covered some of the basics of the psychoeducational report. Are there any questions before I move on? So the IEP is basically serving as the roadmap for educational plans, right? So it's going to dictate the goals, objectives, and all that other kind of fun stuff for the school year. Has descriptions of present levels of academic and functional performance. And Kentucky breaks it down within domains. So it's going to talk about your communication, academic performance, health, vision, hearing, and motor abilities, social and emotional status, general intelligence, transition needs, so these for our kids 14 and older, functional vision, learning and media assessment, as well as functional hearing, listening, and communication assessment. So when needs are identified and described in the present levels of performance, so on your IEP, so especially for initial assessments, we would expect some information provided in the report to kind of transition into the present levels, okay? So the report's dictating where we're at right now. The IEP is kind of describing where the needs are. But when they're describing the needs in the present levels on the IEP, it should first say relative strengths. So what can the student perform really well compared to maybe what they don't do so well. So it might look like something, Johnny is able to read 15 words per minute at the 2nd grade level. Okay, so we know that's what he does pretty well. These are concerns. Johnny is able to answer comprehension questions at the 2nd grade level correctly 15% of the time. Okay, so we're seeing a discrepancy maybe between reading ability and reading comprehension. And then we'll say baseline performance, once again, is kind of what we're documenting right there. He's performing at X level, so that 20% level compared to peers. And last, we'll talk about performance in relationship to similar age peers. And this is what I see left out on IEPs a ton, is what is my child doing in comparison to same age peers? Because this is important for goal development. Why in the heck are you picking one thing over another? And then why is this goal being set in this way? So I think if there's some type of statement relating it back to what would be expected for a similar age peer, can be really helpful to kind of narrow down why the goal has been set in the way it's been set. Because I think that's typically what is left off. Okay, so we've described our present levels of academic and functional performance. We know where we're at. Next, we're going to provide measurable academic and functional goals, as well as benchmarks and short-term objectives. As a quick note, short-term objectives are only required for students on the alternate assessment track by federal law. Now, different states, counties, and local educational agencies and schools may have different rules about whether objectives are included or not. But by federal law, they're not required, so some counties will have them and some will not. Just something to be aware of. And this can be important too because goals tend to be written like by the end of the IEPs. So I think important questions to ask going off that is, well, all right, but what would we expect him to do in 2 months? because that'll help us understand, well, if we're not making anticipated progress, what can we do to fix it, or what can we do to help? So that's why I mentioned that. Goals will include a condition, so given a certain type of instruction, during a structured speech session, when in a small group, where is this goal going to occur? This can also give us an indication about how well it's going to generalize. So if I say my condition is, within science instruction, well, am I also expecting that this will happen in math or something like that? Whoops. It will also have the measurable skill or behavior. And what I mean by measurable is you'll have concrete, actual, observable actions. So things like student will think, student will feel, student will improve are not necessarily measurable. You want some concrete action words. So for example, we'll answer at least 4 reading comprehension questions based on the 8th grade level. We'll make 3 verbal exchanges with a peer. We'll initiate a given work task within 2 minutes with fewer than 3 prompts, are more observable, concrete, measurable goals. And this is important too, because if you are reading the goal and you're not really sure what it looks like, well, that may matter if the IEP goes to another school. If you're not really sure, then maybe a teacher who might pick it up later isn't really sure, and that can affect instruction. You should also have a criterion, and this is basically saying to what degree do we expect this to occur at. So is it with 80% accuracy? Is it in 4 out of 5 consecutive trials? 2 out of 4 situations with no more than 2 prompts? We're looking for how will we know when we mastered this goal, to what level? And last, we're going to look for a specified timeline. Once again, I mentioned this because not all states or counties will require that objectives are included, but it might be a helpful question to ask if you're noticing they're written for the whole year. So these are usually by November of 2019, by the end of the IEP. These are types of statements we'll see in these IEP goals. Okay, so we have present levels, our goals and objectives. We'll also have documentation of progress toward meeting the annual goals and when the reports on progress will be issued. Related services and supplementary aids and services, and then appropriate accommodations. So some examples of a related service might be speech language therapy or occupational therapy. Supplementary aids and services may be small group instruction, repetitive practice, extended time. Accommodations for state assessment might be readers or scribe or extended time. And these are important to document and keep consistent over time, especially as student ages, if things like going to college, documenting once again that these needs have been in place over a period of time and the current accommodations they have in place. And why this even matters is because what we're doing is we're taking all these sources of data from our reports. So we might have intervention data. Typically schools now, especially if there are reading and math concerns, will try to have remedial instruction before initiation for special education is initiated. So what have we tried to do in small groups before referring to special education, and how has it worked? We'll use things like classroom observations or teacher report. We'll use these normative data. So what I mean by that are things like our cognitive functioning or standardized academic functioning to kind of see where we're at and what kind of goals we need to set. So this data is all put in the psychoeducational report, and then that is going to guide what IEP goals and objectives we're setting. So this is pulled directly from the Kentucky State IEP Guidance Development Document. And it says that measurable annual goals are directly related to the student's needs based on the disability and pertain to the needs described in the present levels. Goals should be prioritized based on student need and not eligibility criteria. And I'm mentioning this both because, remember way back when I showed you that eligibility is based on social interactions and communication, right? So if we're saying we're being eligible in autism, then we would expect to see some type of deficits with social skills or communication skills. Those should then be documented in the report as well as the present levels. And that's important because it guides what kind of goals you're getting. So what I also see is pretty common with autism is we'll say, okay, we have these social concerns, we have these communication concerns, here are your reading and math goals. But we're not seeing a connection to things over in time, right? So if we're saying that this is our disability, and we're saying that these are the things that are not the same as same-age peers, then we would expect that our IEP has some goals that are developed to help support the development of those skills. However, going off that, on the flip side, if there are obviously academic concerns, then those should be included on the present levels as well, and also incorporated into subsequent goals. Just as a quick side note, if you're noticing that annual goals for your child are the same year to year, and there's not a lot of progress being made on them, it may be evidence that the student is being denied FAPE, and this was based on the Supreme Court case for Andrew F. So it's important that these goals are appropriately ambitious for your child, and if you're saying that a goal is set and it's at 90% accuracy, and then for the whole next school year it's been set at 95% accuracy, well, what is my child getting at setting that same goal but at a different intensity? And it might be appropriate if it's something like safety skills, and absolutely that should be mastered at 100%, but some other skills it may be okay for that level, and what some other skills we can work on. So some examples of some social skills. In a small group, student will initiate interaction with a peer at least 3 times per session and 5 out of 6 documented trials independently by the end of the IEP. And once again, I'm presenting these because I feel like it's more likely that if we're seeing social and communication deficits based on eligibility, that we should see some kind of social and communication developed goals. Communication, after completing an activity, student will answer at least 2 concrete questions about that activity on 4 out of 5 consecutive trials by the end of the IEP. And then if behavior is a concern, we should also see behavioral goals. And this becomes also important, and I'm going to talk about FBAs here in a second as well. When presented with a frustrating situation, a peer, a staff member, or a test, the student will use coping skills learned and will return to class in 20 minutes or less. What I really like about this is that there are examples in parentheses, so that gives you kind of an idea of what they're looking for. Without that, a frustrating situation is kind of broad, but with examples it helps us give an idea about what might be an issue for that child. So this is something that can be really helpful when writing things like social and behavioral goals, because they're a little bit more abstract than maybe a reading, writing, or math goal. So they're a little bit harder to make concrete, so things like examples within there can be helpful for measurability purposes. I'm also going to briefly mention post-secondary goals. It sounded like a few of you had some older students. Just from research, we know that students with autism have some of the lowest rates of community participation following high school, both within the home, so taking care of things like laundry, as well as getting out there and doing things like going to the movies or grocery shopping, skills like that, compared to all other students with a disability. However, what we found is that they infrequently have independent living post-secondary goals. So they'll have education goals or employment goals, but they're not really addressing any of those independent living skills. So in the IEP meetings, if it's unclear why or why not they qualify, definitely ask, because sometimes districts have rules regarding this. But ask who is eligible for an independent living goal, or why not. Just because you know that some of this is an area of need and it's not necessarily being represented in the schools. And this is our generalization from what we found. This isn't the case, I'm sure, for every
So
school.
will you ask that question?
For independent living goals, I think you can start that starting at 14. I say you ask as soon as that comes up, because sometimes it's going to take pushing. So
And do
not
they
always.
prepare the child once they graduate from high school? When the bus stops, what then?
Right.
What is out there in the community?
Mhm.
And how have they been prepared?
Absolutely.
You know, because I don't see that.
Mhm.
I'm not seeing it.
Mhm.
You know, my daughter does go to they have outings like twice a month, and they'll go to the grocery store and compare prices and things like that, but when I do it with her, that's not what they're doing.
Mhm. Right, and I think this is a common concern across the board. And we talk about that a lot, is that some of these daily living skills, where do we do that at? Because the schools aren't really doing it, and where do you?
It could be written, but that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Just because it's written doesn't mean that's what they're doing.
And if you see that is also equally eligible to take that to, not to be moderated or have a mediator conversation for that, because implementation is just as big of a deal as having it written correctly. So if you feel like it's not working out that way, definitely, call a meeting, ask for what's happening, how can I help? A really polite way to kind of ask questions, to maybe nudge or challenge is to always phrase it back as a question. Well, I'm noticing that, I'm kind of putting it back in the school, so what are you doing? And how can I help? And that will tell you, yes or no, what are you doing? And if that makes sense. So if you're noticing, for example, problems with daily living skills, well, I'm noticing when we go to the store, she's unable to pick out something within a $10 budget, but I thought that's what we were kind of working on when we go out to the community. How can I help this skill at home? Maybe a really, positive way to ask that question, but also kind of check in to make sure things are being implemented as they were documented, if that makes sense. Once again, implications for services. What you want to start out with is when the IEP is presented to you, is look for what is marked as not commensurate with same age peers. And if it's marked as not commensurate with same age peers, there needs to be a description. What are they currently doing? Or what's a strength? What's their baseline? And what are similar age peers doing? So we know kind of what our benchmark or goal would be. And once again, if it's marked as not commensurate as same age peers, it should be addressed somewhere in the IEP. If it's not directly through a goal, it needs to be through maybe some type of accommodation or modification or related service, something that's helping to support this. And also, I've never been formally employed as a school psychologist. This has just been what I've kind of heard through the grapevine, so to say. So districts have certain rules about who is eligible for what type of goal, I've heard. So for example, I've heard that sometimes, bear with me here, that if your standard score is within, so this is why these scores are once again really important. So I know for ADHD, for example, in order to be eligible for an academic goal, so you will more than likely have, a task goal, right, staying on task typically. But in order to be eligible for an academic goal, the child has to be with a certain standard score point or lower to be eligible for an academic goal. So I would check in with your district's rules on that, or how that works, because I can't provide an overarching, this is how it always goes, and some districts might not have any rules regarding that. So be on the lookout for that, because I think that can be really hard too, because we're trying to individualize instruction. So if there's a need, it should be documented and then incorporated as a goal. But obviously, to make sure we're being maybe fair, or I really can't speak much to maybe why this is the way it is, but
So if you have a cognitive functioning that is like 2 or 3 standard deviations below the norm, there are certain goals in the academic arena that you're not eligible to use in your IEP?
I think it actually works in the opposite. So if scores are too high, typically, so no. If there's a need, if it's, especially if it's that much lower, 2 or 3 standard deviations, that's pretty extreme, then yes, we would definitely expect a goal in that area. I think what we're noticing though is we're letting the eligibility category drive what type of goals we're getting, not the need, right? So if we see that, for example, if you are found eligible for ADHD, for example, we would then, all right, so attention's a problem, we're going to write an on-task goal for you. That's your goal. Okay, but you're not, since your academic functioning is high, then you're not eligible for an academic goal, right? So that's kind of more of the rules that they might have. Not necessarily, if you're 2 to 3 standard deviations low, you should be having goals related to that area. But a good way to kind of key into that is look at what's commensurate and what's not, and then following that into the goal section of the IEP, seeing what's there to cover kind of what isn't marked off as the same as peers. Because once again, we were noticing, especially for autism, there was a lot of push for more academic-based goals, and these social and communication skills, especially as the student ages, were kind of slowly dropped off a little bit. But just things to watch for.
And it's maybe just me not understanding. So, like, is it with the Andrews case, the Supreme Court case?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just struggling with kind of, so it sounds like when you have twice exceptional students, so maybe kids that have like the average or above average IQ, there are certain things that there's some kind of secret district policy out there that no, this child can't have these kind of things because of it's almost like almost like reverse discrimination, or maybe that's just me misunderstanding.
And I think the point is not, and once again, I know very, very little about this. I could even be misspeaking, but my experience has been that I've heard something like this before, where if your academic scores are high enough, then you're not going to be eligible for an academic goal. And that to some extent makes sense, right? Because we also don't want to just give all types of goals or put your child in special education all day long because they have autism, right? We want to make sure if their academic skills are commensurate with same age peers, then that we're not giving them academic goals because they don't need that. But, I think my issue can sometimes be that if you're saying, your cognitive functioning is like 140 and your academic standards scores are like 80, but that's not below your cutoff, well, those are pretty discrepant still, and you should still maybe work on those types of things because we're seeing a discrepancy between the potential. Like, the likelihood of that case might not actually exist, but those are just things that can kind of be a problem with that. I see benefits because it can protect people from being over pushed into special education for things they might not necessarily need, but it can also hinder people, like you were saying, who are twice exceptional, or if the spread is still wide enough between some of the other skills. And this is why IEPs are individualized, and district rules like this sometimes don't necessarily make the best sense. But I can also see benefits because it does, protect children to some extent from being over inundated in special education services that may or may not be necessary. But yeah, so asking questions if it doesn't make sense, literally ask all the time. Why or why not, I think, is a very valid and very fair question. Because sometimes even I'm kind of like, why this goal? Why? It doesn't necessarily make sense to me when I'm looking at it. So if I'm not understanding why they have goals in certain areas, then I would imagine that most people wouldn't. So I think those are okay questions to ask always. Just like I said, ask how the goals are set and to what level, all the time. Side note for behavior, a functional behavior assessment is legally required before a change of placement. So if your school is saying, we're noticing some really intense behaviors, we're going to have to put them into special ed or send them to a different school, an FEA is required. They cannot make any sort of change without a functional behavior assessment first. Because I feel like this is something, FEAs are not something we do a really great job at doing all the time. Not that they can be done, it's a legal right, always.
I was going to say, yeah, you can always ask for one.
Yes, always. And they are obligated to do it. I think there's a little bit of hesitation sometimes, but you are legally obligated. If you request it, they have to do it. Especially if it's involved in change of placement.
I'm playing devil's advocate. What do they say no? If you make the request for it, and they say no.
I would put everything in writing, and I would take it to the next level up. And I would say, I requested this, my school said no. I would like to have a hearing, or whatever that next step may be, but definitely having all your requests in writing. Don't call up the school and be like, I want this. You email, you take it to, if it's not being...
It's called a formal complaint.
Yes.
I've done it.
Yes.
I always tell parents to always record their
And I got what
IEP
I
meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Always record the audio on your IEP meetings. They might not let you record video, but record audio.
And you can also, here's a question, could you also request then an independent evaluation?
Yes.
At school
Yes.
district?
Yes.
Yes, I did that too. One's an associate's.
Mm-hmm.
Everything she's talking about, I've done it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it works. It does. It does work. It really helped my daughter.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about progress monitoring for your goals because I'm noticing, I've had this from several parents at this point in time, say, here's my progress monitoring, I don't know what this means. So it's kind of concerning to me that these reports are being sent home and there's no idea about how to interpret what we're looking at. And once again, every school might be a little different in how they do this. This is just some general rules and hopefully this helps a little bit. So I'm going to show you guys a graph. We're going to work through an example together. Can everyone see this kind of okay? Maybe? So I can come up and point if I need to. And I actually might. So what we're going to see here is these green lines right here. These are our data points. So this is what's actually collected. Our purple line is our goal line. What do we expect to see? And our trend line is based on all of Evan's data so far. This is the trend we're seeing over time, or this is what we project to see. Okay, so how is he trending based on his current data points right here? This is the goal we're setting, this is how he's currently doing, and these are his exact data points. Okay? Okay, so great, but how do you know if you're making progress, right? So one method we can use is called a 4-point method. And so if you're seeing these progress reports, they tend to look a little bit kind of like that in my experience. If they look different, let me know. But if in 3 weeks of instruction have occurred, and you have at least 6 data points, you can make decisions based on examining the 4 most recent points. So if the 4 most recent points, or on the consecutive measures, whatever it might be, this is a CBM or curriculum-based measurement assessment, are above the goal line, you can increase the goal. We can make it, all right, this is fine, this is attainable, so we're going to increase our standard. If the 4 most recent and consecutive data points are below the goal line, then you need an instructional change. And if our 4 data points are hovering around the goal line, no change is necessary. And the whole time we're analyzing this is a continuous assessment of progress. We're collecting data and ensuring that adequate progress continues. So we can make these decisions, but we keep collecting progress while this is happening. We can also do trend line analysis. So this is if 4 weeks of instruction have occurred and there are at least 8 data points. We can look at the student's trend compared to their goal line. So if the trend line is steeper than the goal line, we can increase the goal. And that's basically telling us the instruction we're receiving right now is effective. If the trend line is flatter than the goal line, the student is making insufficient progress and we need to change the instructional program. And if the trend line and the goal line are the same, no changes are needed. Okay, so if we're looking at this, based on these 2 different methods, what course of action would you say needed to happen? So we can use either method, either the 4-point or the trend line and goal line analysis. Remember, our goal line is that purple line and our trend line is the orange line, and the data points are green.
Would you get somebody need?
So yes, you would want an instructional change, absolutely. So we're seeing our trend line's below the goal line, and our 4 most recent data points are mostly below trend line as well. So we're needing an instructional change. But we're also noticing there is some progress being made, right? We're seeing some improvements. So it could be that maybe we just need more intense instruction. Maybe instead of a 30-minute session, we need 45, and we need it 4 times a week rather than 3 times a week. Because clearly he's responding, he's just not making the progress that we expected to see. Never ever should the goal be reduced because the student is not making progress. That is not what happens. The goal remains the same, or it goes up, but it doesn't go down. Instructional change happens if we're not making adequate progress. And this is once again where I definitely think it's okay to ask, okay, so it's been 8 weeks, this is our progress, I'm seeing we're not making progress, or we are making progress. Are we going to keep what we're doing? Do we need to change something? What needs to happen? Some other key points that kind of could maybe not fit neatly in here, and we've talked about most of these. So what are the options if your child's not found eligible for services? So if you disagree, you can request an independent educational evaluation, and that is covered by the school. Or they may be eligible for 504 accommodations and modifications. So if you kind of agree with all the data the school is sharing with you, maybe accommodations and modifications are what they need instead. Because what's special about the IEP is that they're changing and differentiating the instruction. But maybe your child just needs extended time on the test or testing in a separate location. Then maybe a 504 would be okay. What types of goals should be included? I can't give you a catch-all answer here because it depends on your student's need, right? However, we do know based on the eligibility criteria that if they're found eligible for autism, we are saying there is a social skills deficit and a communication skills deficit. So those would be the first 2 areas I'd look for every time. And if they're not there, then we can talk about how we can politely maybe ask, why not? And if your child is not making progress on their IEP, once again, instruction has changed, the goal is not reduced. Once again, summary recommendations are a key part of the report. These reports can be 20 to 30 pages single-space long, and it's just overwhelming and a lot. It's a lot of information. So, but the summary should give you about a page, and it should have all the major points, and we can kind of know what all the data is saying. Questions we can ask to kind of politely maybe say why or why not. What data supports including an IEP goal in this area is a great way to say, okay, I want data to support why or why not this goal has been included. Another way, I'm noticing that social skills are marked as commensurate with same age peers on his or her IEP, but all of his or her goals are related to academic skills. So how can we work on maybe these social skills throughout the year? Once again, another way to kind of ask why this is happening. And then what is the same age peer expected to do on this? This is especially helpful for these social communication and behavioral skills. So how much of the class period should they be on task for a same age peer? What is typical for them? And another, especially as the student is aging, and we know generalization can be tricky for students with autism, so asking, how will this skill or this accommodation or this related service help my child be successful in either the general education classrooms or at home in their community? So really getting at not only how is this goal going to help them, within your classroom, but how will this kind of expand to influence his or her performance in other locations. And once again, I'm not telling you this as like the school's doing everything wrong and out to get me. Generally speaking, your schools are on your side and they want to help you and they want to see your child succeed. But these are kind of key points to kind of look for and be like thoughtful with questions and making sure that they're working with you and with your child. So, but yeah, that's really all I have. Thank you for listening. I know this is long and a lot of language.
Thank you.
Do you have a statistics minor or accounting classes?
I am glad that I'm flattered that you asked, but I do not.
Oh my gosh, being able to interpret so much of that, really, the percentages and
what it all means.
into graphics.
Would be